The national portion of the real estate exam requires a deep understanding of flood zones and wetlands regulations because these environmental factors significantly impact property ownership and mandatory disclosure requirements. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, maps out areas across the country and designates certain regions as special flood hazard areas. On the exam, you will likely see these referred to as SFHAs. These are areas that have a 1% or greater chance of flooding in any given year, commonly known as the 100-year floodplain. When a property is located within an SFHA, specifically zones A or V, and the buyer is obtaining a federally related mortgage, flood insurance is not optional, it is a federal requirement. Zone A is typically used for inland areas, while Zone V is reserved for coastal areas where there is an additional hazard from storm waves. A common trap on the exam is suggesting that standard homeowners insurance covers flood damage. You must remember that it does not. Flood insurance must be purchased separately, usually through the National Flood Insurance Program. Another trick the exam might throw at you involves the lender role. While the government through FEMA maps the zones, it is the lender who is legally obligated to ensure the insurance is in place to protect the collateral for the federally backed loan. If a property is in Zone X or C, it is considered outside the high-risk area, and while insurance is available and often recommended, it is not federally mandated. You should also be aware of the concept of base flood elevation, which is the height to which floodwater is anticipated to rise during a base flood. Properties built in these zones often have higher construction costs due to requirements for elevation or flood venting. Moving into wetlands, the exam focuses on the Clean Water Act, specifically Section 404. You must understand that wetlands are not just obvious swamps or marshes. They are defined by three specific criteria: the presence of water, specific hydric soil types, and hydrophytic vegetation that thrives in saturated conditions. For the real estate exam, the most critical takeaway is that any development, dredging, or filling of wetlands requires a permit from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. This is a significant encumbrance on a property. If a buyer wants to build a dock or a home on a lot that contains wetlands, they cannot simply proceed. They must go through a federal permitting process, which can be long, expensive, and may ultimately result in a denial. The exam will test this as a form of land use control. You might see a question asking which agency oversees wetland development, and the answer is always the Army Corps of Engineers. A key mnemonic to keep these straight is the phrase A and V means mandatory. This helps you remember that zones A and V are the high-risk areas where insurance is required for federal loans. When you see a question about whether a licensee needs to disclose that a property is in a flood zone, the answer is almost always yes. Being in a flood zone or containing wetlands is considered a material fact because it fundamentally affects the property value, the cost of ownership, and the owner's ability to use or develop the land. The exam often presents a scenario where a seller says they have never seen the basement flood, but the map shows the house is in Zone A. In this case, the official FEMA map is the authoritative source, and the licensee must ensure the flood zone status is disclosed regardless of the seller's personal history or the lack of recent flood events. Watch out for wording that confuses the Clean Water Act with the Clean Air Act or the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, also known as CERCLA. While CERCLA deals with hazardous waste and financial liability for cleanup, the Clean Water Act is your primary focus for wetlands and water quality. If you are asked about the impact of wetlands on a developer plans, remember that the federal government priority is the preservation of these ecosystems, which often leads to strict limitations on buildable area. Always frame your exam answers around the idea that environmental regulations like these are public land use controls that serve the public interest and override individual property rights in terms of development potential.